Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for Whatculture.com. And you know what, making a movie, even a terrible one, is incredibly difficult. And of the many things that can go wrong, there's always just the possibility that you'll just run out of money. And when that happened for these films, they took some rather outlandish routes to get back on track. So let's take a look at them. This is Whatculture.com, and these are movies that did crazy things when they ran out of money. Director Renny Harlin spent $1 million of his own money to fix the script, Cutthroat Island. Films don't get much more calamitous than Cutthroat Island, the 1995 action-adventure film that bombed so catastrophically at the box office that it put studios off swashbuckling movies for almost an entire decade. That was until Pirates of the Caribbean reaffirmed their commercial viability. The production was beset by numerous delays and on-set accidents which caused the budget to balloon to a ludicrous $98 million by the time it was all said and done, though some estimates even peg it as high as $115 million. Furthermore, the script just wasn't working during pre-production, and though Renny Harlin asked the producers to bankroll rewrites, production company Carolco Pictures was on the verge of bankruptcy and had no further funds to give. As a result, a desperate Harlin ended up spending $1 million of his own cash to pay the writers to complete a new draft. Even though Harlin was a rising superstar director after the success of Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger, that was still a majorly drastic move for any filmmaker. And it was ultimately all for naught. The film was critically panned, with particular attention paid to its shoddy screenplay, while Harlin received a Worst Director Razzie nomination, and it grossed a brutal $10 million worldwide.
George Miller paid the crew in beer and used his own car in a stunt, Mad Max. The original Mad Max was made for just $400,000, which, given the necessity for sequences involving risky stunts, was certainly quite the ask. But filmmaker George Miller at least had a novel and very Australian way to keep the movie at low cost, by deciding to pay his extras and some of the crew not with money, but beer. It's certainly not a call that would fly on any union set today. However, beyond keeping the cast and crew in suds, Miller further kept the balance sheet in check by using and crashing his own 1966 Mazda Bongo for one of the movie's vehicular stunts. Thankfully, Mad Max's phenomenal worldwide success ensured that Miller was blessed with a budget more than 10 times the size for the sequel, allowing everyone to actually get paid, cash money.
Robert Rodriguez kept bloopers in the film because he couldn't afford multiple takes. El Mariachi. Robert Rodriguez wrote the book on how to produce an ultra-low budget movie, quite literally in fact, because he chronicled the production of his filmmaking debut El Mariachi in the much-loved 1992 tome Rebel Without a Crew, or how a 23-year-old filmmaker with $7,000 became a Hollywood player. Indeed, Rodriguez produced his entire indie western for barely $7,000, much of which he raised by participating in experimental drug trials, using every corner-cutting trick possible to ensure that he didn't run over budget, because, he literally had no other option. Rodriguez borrowed a 60mm camera, shot every scene in just 1 or 2 takes, edited on video to save money, and used real guns because he couldn't afford prop ones, as well as having his cast also double as crew members. The budget was so razor thin that if the maximum 2 takes of a single setup were blown by mistakes, he would simply incorporate the goofs into the story or cut to the next setup as soon as possible, hence the film's oft choppy editing style. And yet, despite being so blatantly held together with duct tape and sheer can-do spirit, El Mariachi's feverish charm and energy endeared itself to critics and indie film fans, launching Rodriguez's Hollywood career in the process.
Setting it on a single night to reduce wardrobe costs, Halloween. Given that John Carpenter's Halloween was made for just $325,000 back in 1978, the budget was razor thin, with Carpenter and his crew pulling out every penny-pinching trick in the book to keep things chugging along. One of the more inconspicuously expensive aspects of filmmaking is costuming, of acquiring all the different outfits for the various characters across the various days in which the story takes place. On bigger productions, this alone can end up costing more than Halloween's entire budget. And so Carpenter and co-writer Deborah Hill came up with a novel solution. While the film was originally set to transpire over several days, it was decided instead to have the carnage take place on a single night in order to minimize the number of costume changes required for the cast. Hell, the wardrobe requirements were consistently so minimal that Jamie Lee Curtis bought her own clothes for the film from department store JCPenney for a mere $100. And then once the film had cut costs by setting itself on a single day, Carpenter and Hill had their big brainstorm moment by making that day Halloween.
Director George Slicer borrowed money from the French mob. The Vanishing, 1988. 1988's Dutch horror masterpiece The Vanishing is a film of such composed confidence that it feels like every aspect of the production went exactly as filmmaker George Slicer originally planned, and yet the film was reportedly made for a budget of just $165,000, which was so scant it wasn't even enough to feed the cast and crew through to the end of shooting. According to the director, he ended up paying a visit to some shady figures from the French criminal underworld and asked them for a loan. The mobsters complied, but also assured the filmmaker of the dire consequences if he couldn't settle his debt as agreed. Slicer didn't elaborate on how it all shook out, but given that the film was a considerable critical and commercial success, and he lived for another 25 years seemingly free of mob hassle, the gamble evidently paid off.
Condensing 3 movies into 2, The Lord of the Rings. Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated adaptation of The Lord of the Rings was originally intended to be a trilogy, with one film planned for each of J.R.R. Tolkien's 3 novels. Yet budgetary limitations resulted in Studio United Artists condensing the 3 books into 2 movies, with the first film adapting all of the Fellowship of the Ring and half of the Two Towers. Bakshi produced the film for just $4 million, which combined with the movie's pricey and time-consuming animation made it a stressful project for the filmmaker. Furthermore, the studio made the ill-advised decision to remove Part 1 from the title, ensuring audiences who expected to see a full adaptation of Tolkien's trilogy were left bitterly disappointed by seeing only half the story. And to make matters worse, despite the film turning a hefty profit, disagreements between Bakshi and United Artists led to Part 2 never being made.
William Shatner recycled footage, extras, and costumes. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is generally accepted to be the worst of all the Trek movies. It's a bit of a bore for the most part and lacks the glossy, big-budget feel of its predecessors, despite having a markedly bigger budget than the 3 prior sequels. The William Shatner-directed project was a massive challenge for all involved. There was considerable pre-production squabbling over the script, Shatner wrestled with Paramount over the budget, there was a Writers Guild strike going on, and there were major issues while shooting on location and during post-production. Because Shatner's budget was revised and by his own claim he didn't receive enough help to correctly allocate his allotted money, he had to cut corners at almost every turn to bring it on budget. This included reusing the same extras in different camera setups to imply Cybok's ability was larger, recycling costumes from previous Trek films, and filming the campfire scenes closer up because there wasn't time or money to build more expansive sets for wide shots. Worst of all, the film's climax was originally intended to have Kirk be chased by a fleet of rock monsters, but when there simply wasn't the money to pull it off and a single rock monster test scene wasn't satisfactory, Shatner was out of options. As a result, he ended up reusing previously shot footage of God for the climax, who manifests and attempts to kill Kirk only to be blown to smithereens by Klingon disruptor fire. As much stick as Shatner gets for this movie, it really does seem like he tried to make the best of a rather terrible situation.
The producers remortgaged their homes, Rocky. When Sylvester Stallone was first shopping Rocky around to studios, United Artists offered him $325,000 for the screenplay, with plans to produce it on a $2 million budget. But when Stallone insisted that he also play the lead role, despite United Artists planning to cast a name actor, the studio agreed with a provision that the budget be slashed in half. And moreover, any financial overspill would be covered by producers Irwin Winkler and Robert Chartoff. Ultimately, Rocky ended up grossing $1.1 million, with Winkler and Chartoff raising the additional $100,000 overspill by remortgaging their homes. It was certainly a bold gamble, but also one of the smartest in the history of Hollywood, given that Rocky went on to gross an eye-watering $225 million globally and kickstart a still ongoing franchise that made Stallone, Winkler, and Chartoff all the big bucks.
Orson Welles set a scene in a Turkish bath so he didn't need costumes. Othello, 1951. Though Orson Welles might be remembered as a staunch perfectionist, he also rolled with the punches when necessary, as he proved beyond any and all doubt while he was filming his 1951 adaptation of Shakespeare's Othello. The film was ultimately shot over the period of 3 years, initially being shut down after the original producer announced bankruptcy mere days into shooting. Welles decided to salvage the film by funding it himself, but due to the massive costs involved, he had to intermittently shoot between acting projects which he was using to bankroll production. Filming was stopped at least 3 times. During one of the shooting cycles, Welles ran so dry of money that the costumes being used for the film had to be impounded due to unpaid fees. Unable to deal with costly delays by sourcing new costumes, Welles had a rather ingenious light bulb idea for shooting an upcoming murder scene. Welles decided to change the setting to a Turkish bath because this would provide a logical reason for the characters not being in their typical mode of attire, allowing him to keep filming despite the wardrobe being actually locked in storage. This is just one of the solutions that Welles found to combat his bleeding budget, but it's by far the most impressively creative.
The set was only half built. 310 to Yuma. James Mangold's 2007 remake of 310 to Yuma is a certified banger of a western, and given that westerns typically require large sets to be built complete with elaborate costumes and so on, it's little surprise that they tend to be expensive movies to make. 310 to Yuma ended up costing $55 million, a relatively modest sum considering its scale and celebrated cast, and so the margins were tight enough that the movie was eventually shot without the central Arizona town being fully built. During the film's action-packed climax, it's even easy to spot unfinished buildings in the background, with scaffolding built up all around them. While they fit perfectly into the movie's aesthetic, buildings need to be built after all, and the town was indeed originally meant to be finished before shooting. Without any additional money to pay the crew to complete construction though, many of them were left as half-built husks, with Mangold presumably having any contemporary-looking equipment shuffled out of the way before shooting.
The Python team came up with a fourth-wall-breaking ending, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Monty Python and the Holy Grail ends in rather hilariously surreal fashion as the army of knights prepares to assault the French soldiers, only for modern-day police to arrive out of nowhere, arrest King Arthur and Bedivere, and break the camera. It truly feels like the film couldn't have ended any other way, and yet the Python team have confirmed numerous times over the years that an original scripted climax involved the actual battle that was set up in those final moments. Allegedly due to how much money had been spent on pyrotechnics for Tim the Enchanter's scene, there just wasn't enough money left to stage and shoot a battle in earnest, and so this fourth-wall-breaking ending was dreamt up instead. Co-star Michael Palin quite aptly called the ultimate ending both cheaper and funnier. This approach wouldn't work for more straight-laced movies, but something as willfully farcical as Monty Python, well, it absolutely did work.
Going live action for one shot, Heavy Metal. 1981's legendary adult animated anthology film Heavy Metal was produced on a relatively scant $9.3 million budget considering its visual ambition. Though some of the shots throughout the film were rotoscoped, there's a single shot at the very end of the movie that was entirely live action. Because the production ran out of cash and had the release date moved up by several months unexpectedly, there simply wasn't time to rotoscope the house explosion in the final scene. And so it's simply a live action shot of a model house being blown up, albeit somewhat cleverly disguised by being tinted green and oversaturated, to give it a more surreal, heightened look that better fits in with the animated shots surrounding it. The shot passes quickly enough that many might not even notice that it's live action at all, but as the house's debris flies through the air, it's nevertheless clear we're not looking at something animated.
Spike Lee gave up most of his fee and asked black celebrities for donations. Malcolm X. Spike Lee's Malcolm X ended up costing $35 million, which was almost as expensive as Lee's 5 previous films combined. Even with the epic biopic Lee was trying to make, some pushback from Warner Brothers wasn't entirely unreasonable, who had reservations about the $30 million that Lee asked for and also demands of a 3-hour runtime. Lee was nevertheless allowed to begin filming with $28 million as a budget, and convinced Warner Brothers to raise it to $33 million during shooting. But as Lee continued to shoot and found himself unable to get any more money from the studio, he decided to surrender $2 million of his own $3 million salary to the budget. After 4 months of shooting were completed, the insurance company took control of the film, and amid runtime arguments between between Lee and the studio shut down post-production with the costs running dry. Lee got desperate and made the highly unconventional decision to effectively crowdfund post-production from prominent black celebrities, including Bill Cosby, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Janet Jackson, and Prince. These donations, not investments, Lee made clear, allowed Lee to get back into the editing suite and finish the 201-minute cut that he envisioned from the outset. Though Malcolm X was a modest commercial success and netted Denzel Washington a Best Actor Oscar nomination, Lee's unconventional chicanery soured his relationship with Warner Brothers for years, such that he was prevented from helping develop Space Jam.
Switching to black and white film, If. The 1968 satirical drama If is shot in both colour and black and white, with director Lindsay Anderson regularly switching between the two in a way that seems more or less random, despite some viewers' desperate need to extrapolate meaning from it. The truth, in fact, is that the production, priced at just $500,000, was low on both funds and time. While shooting scenes set inside a chapel, Anderson realized he could save both by shooting in black and white, given that lighting scenes for color takes much longer. After that, Anderson decided to shoot additional scenes in monochrome, and with films generally being shot out of sequence, the rhyme and reason to which scenes were color and which were black and white was fluid, to say the least. Given the film's surreal bent, it's been said that Anderson additionally wanted to throw audiences off and keep them uneasy with the seemingly unmotivated divergence into black and white. It's weird, but it certainly works, while saving the production desperately needed money and time.
Planned sets were replaced with cardboard cutouts, the adventures of Baron Munchausen. Terry Gilliam strikes again, this time not in a $400,000 Monty Python film, but the $46.63 million 1988 fantasy flick The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Incredibly, the project was originally budgeted at $23.5 million, which ballooned to roughly double that by the end of production, a figure which Gilliam predictably disputes. Whatever the true price tag, plans to build a Moon City set at Pinewood Studios were scrapped because there literally wasn't the money to create them. Gilliam, ever a man to thrive under pressure, decided instead to have the concept sketches of the city enlarged, printed, and stuck to giant plywood boards, which were then moved around by crew hands as necessary to imply movement and scale. And so when the Baron and Sally arrive at the city, it has a really weird surreal 2D aesthetic, which rather than suggest budgetary constraints, feels totally on brand for Gilliam's madcap vision. Though the film was ultimately a massive commercial failure, grossing barely $8 million globally, it was at least nominated for 4 Oscars, including Best Art Direction and Best Visual Effects.
The Epilogue was a series of storyboards, Skyline. 2010 sci-fi disaster film Skyline had a production budget listed as somewhere between $10 to $20 million. Yet despite this, the actual money put aside for physical shooting was just $500,000. The rest of the budget was spent on executing the movie's ambitious visual effects sequences, yet this evidently didn't stretch to the epilogue, where Elaine is rescued from the aliens by her now alien husband, Jared. As a result, this sequence was reduced down to a series of crudely animated storyboards interspersed throughout the credits, as they presumably cost a mere fraction of actually shooting and rendering the entire scene the traditional way. Despite how impossible it is to take the movie's ending seriously, Skyline turned a solid profit at the box office, enough to produce 2 better received sequels beyond Skyline and Skylines.
The cast and crew took out high-interest bank loans and begged local businesses to help. The Evil Dead. It isn't a secret to anyone that Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead was a seat-of-the-pants production where he and his inexperienced cast and crew wrung every last penny out of their $375,000 budget. Halfway through filming in the winter of 1980, Raimi actually ran out of money, and so in order to restart shooting, Raimi, his producer, and star Bruce Campbell committed themselves to doing whatever it took to find the extra funds. Between them, they took out high-interest bank loans, borrowed money from friends and families, and even cold-called local businesses around Michigan begging for catering resources, gasoline, and all of the other logistical accoutrements a film production needs. These risky gambles all paid off, as The Evil Dead was a phenomenal commercial success that launched an entire horror empire that is still thriving today.
Deadpool forgets his guns, Deadpool. Though it's clear that Deadpool was produced on a more conservative budget than your average superhero film, it was nevertheless originally given a provisional $66 million price tag by Fox. But just before the movie was given the official green light, they slashed the budget by $8 million, knocking it down to $58 million. This created a headache for Ryan Reynolds and the filmmakers, who had to figure out a way to execute the film's vision with a hefty chunk of the expected moolah slashed away. This ultimately led to a last-minute write where 9 pages were cut from the script, including an elaborate gunfight planned for the finale. And so, embracing the title's character wink wink spirit, the rewrites had Deadpool forget his duffel bag of guns, forcing him to forge ahead without them. Most serious-minded action movies couldn't get away with something so daft, and yet, given Deadpool's whole shtick, it worked perfectly, helping lower the budget while giving the audience a laugh.
The second unit was sent home early, Masters of the Universe. Production on 1987's live-action He-Man movie Masters of the Universe was an utter mess. It was by far the most expensive film ever produced by the Cannon Group at the time, and they were desperate enough for a smash hit after a string of flops that eventually added $7 million to the superheroes flick's budget, bringing it to a hefty $22 million. Nevertheless, Cannon were obsessed with cutting budgetary corners wherever possible, scrapping planned sequences, and at one point even dismissing the film's entire second unit team. Though the film does have a credited second unit, Cannon executives sent them home during filming rather than pay them to complete pickups, insisting instead that director Gary Goddard carry out any additional photography.
Ending the movie with an abrupt title card, Blood Debts. Little concrete is known about the production of 1985's cult action film Blood Debts, though it's clear to anyone who's seen more than a few seconds of it that it was a roughshod shoot thrown together on a shoestring budget. It is, in its own way, a tremendously entertaining Death Wish knockoff in which Vietnam vet Mark Collins becomes a one-man army to avenge his daughter's rape and murder. Later, Mark's vigilantism brings him to blow with corrupt businessman Bill, leading to a delightfully action-packed climax in which Mark assaults Bill's henchman-filled compound. Bill finally seems to have the drop on gravely wounded Mark, until Mark pulls a concealed rocket launcher from his sleeve and fires it. The rocket hits Bill, instantly exploding him. But before his remains have even hit the ground, the shot abruptly freezes and a title card appears on screen, explaining that Mark turned himself into the police after the shootout and is now serving a life sentence. A few seconds later, the credits roll, and that's that. Though it's basically impossible not to laugh at such a harshly abrupt ending, it's also howlingly obvious that director Teddy Page ran out of funds to film the movie's actual ending, presumably where Mark turns himself in. It's easy to believe, whether true or not, that the remaining film in the movie's budget literally ran out in the middle of Bill's body being blown through the air.